Welcome to the Dr. Broadway Podcast, the theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I am your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, joined as always by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, tell us what we're talking about today.
Today we start with Oklahoma, right?
That's a big
smack
one.
Dab in the middle of our musical theater history timeline.
Well, and I want you to unpack that a little bit. Tell me why we're starting right in the middle of the timeline instead of going with the Black Crook, your favorite.
Honestly, this was an idea that I got from a theater history professor in Chicago named Sheldon Patinkin. I sadly think he's passed on, but he wrote a book called No Legs, No Jokes, No Chance, which we're going to talk a little bit about that quote here in a minute. And it struck me, it's one of the better, I think, musical theater histories out there, and it struck me because he started with Oklahoma, and I was like, why would you start in the middle of the timeline instead of the others? And it really is so fundamental to understand that Oklahoma is that linchpin, he said, kind of in the middle of the timeline, where everything before Oklahoma is trying to get to Oklahoma, and everything on the other side of the timeline is trying to be better than Oklahoma. It all seems to coalesce around this moment. And so it makes it a really, really important moment in the timeline, in perspective, but also in the development of the musical as a whole. And it has helped, I think, at least, in 10, 15, 20 years. How many years have I been doing this? Almost 18, 20 years of teaching musical theater history. It's really, really helped students understand kind of what comes before, what comes after, and what we're responding to. Because as we know, development of any art form tends to rely on what came before. In this particular case, we just seem to have this nice little middle point where everything's trying to get there and then everything's trying to innovate from there. So that's why we're starting in the middle.
And I love that. I was not familiar with his work, nor was I familiar with that kind of paradigm through which to orient your study of musical theater history, but I love it. You introduced me to it, and I think it makes so much sense. So to put a number on it, Oklahoma premiered on Broadway in March of 1943. So if you're wondering where we are, if you've listened to the timeline episodes and you're familiar with that wonderful outline that Tracey went through from the beginning of American history, really, when we have traveling shows and things like that to get to where we are now, we're now in 1943. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to those, that is great background information for what you're going to hear today. Having said that, let's get started with Oklahoma. Now, we often think about Oklahoma as, rightly, we think Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. And in fact, it is Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. It's their very first collaboration. Of course, they would go on to collaborate on some of the most outstanding musicals of the Golden Age, from The King and I to Carousel to one of my favorites, The Sound of Music, which I always say was a gateway drug to musical theater for me.
For most people of our age group.
Yes.
It's what was shown on TV.
And VHS. VHS was
Exactly.
brand new when we were coming up and we could watch it. Both cassettes. There were 2 video cassettes. Anyway, I digress. So at any rate, so they had this long historic career. They changed the paradigm, as Tracey has alluded to. And so we think it kind of always existed, but in fact, that's not the case. It was a relatively short collaboration, like I said, starting in 1943 with Oklahoma and then ending in 1960 with Oscar Hammerstein's death. So what we want to talk about now is, how did this collaboration come to be? And, we always think about Rodgers and Hammerstein, but I want to backpedal just a little bit to talk about Rodgers and Hart. Now, Rodgers and Hart were a collaborative team prior to Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hart had been working together since the 1910s,
Mhm.
1919, I believe. They had their first number interpolated into a musical. Richard Rodgers was just a teenage composer at that point. Lorenz Hart was in his early 20s, worked as a lyricist. But when I say they had a song interpolated into a show, Tracey, can you expand on what that means for those who may not be familiar with that term? Because it doesn't happen as much nowadays as it did back then.
It doesn't happen because of Rodgers and Hammerstein,
Right,
which is
right.
what's so impressive about it.
Yes.
Up until the up in, up until Oklahoma, up until the early 1940s, what would happen is we had this place called Tin Pan Alley, and the best songwriters and lyricists would have their own rooms in along this street, basically shops, song shops, and you'd go in and look for a new song for your headliner, and you'd be like, "That's a great song for my headliner. Let's grab that. Okay, what musical are we doing? We're gonna throw that song in the middle of it." A lot of times, this was a way to shake up old material. But essentially, what you're doing is you're taking a song that's just been written by itself and you're inserting it into a musical or an operetta that just to kind of spice it up a bit. That's how they wrote musicals at that point. It wasn't like, I have a storyline and I'm going to write some songs for this storyline. It was literally like, I have these songs, let's write some content around these songs. Like our jukebox musicals. Very, very,
Right.
very much so. That's how it worked.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll get in later to why she said because of Oklahoma we don't do this anymore, but she's
Yeah.
absolutely right. But I just wanted to clarify what that meant because it's not a practice that we are as familiar with nowadays.
Hmm.
So after that first interpolation into 1919's A Lonely Romeo, they went on to do incredible things, but they had a relatively slow start. So
Hmm.
their career would eventually include shows like By Jupiter and Lady Be Good. Not Lady Be Good. Not Lady Be Good. That's Gershwin Brothers. But they would go on to do,
I was like, which one
yeah,
is she thinking of?
that's not it. That's not right. That's not right. They would go on to some great shows, and they're better known because so many of those musical comedy shows were just completely forgettable. They're better known for songs like "The Lady Is a Tramp" and "Thou
Hmm.
Swell, Thou Witty," the "My Funny Valentine," "Isn't It Romantic," and then a song called "Manhattan" that was written in 1925.
Hmm.
And that song, Manhattan, was written just as Rodgers and Hart were about to throw in the towel. They had had that song interpolated into A Lonely Romeo in 1919. And then after that, things were slow. They were writing amateur shows, which we'll do another episode on rather than digging into here. But they were writing amateur shows. They were not, it was not a cataclysmic launch that they had into success. And so they were like, you know what? I think we're going to have to do other things. We've got to support ourselves. We're not getting any younger. We can't live on mom and dad's dime anymore. And so they were just about to throw in the towel on their collaboration when they were given a chance to have an office, a place to work, and a show to write another song for by a group called the Theater Guild. And the Theater Guild was a really important producing group that set out to produce really new American works. So the head of that was a woman named Teresa Helburn, and she worked very closely with her co-producer, Lawrence Langner, and they produced some great American works
Hmm.
of the 20th century, particularly worked very closely with Eugene O'Neill to produce some of his new plays at the time. And they were building a new theater and they wanted some curtains for that theater. And so they were having a fundraiser and they told Rodgers and Hart, y'all write us some songs for that fundraiser. And that's what happened. Well, as luck would have it, that little fundraiser show became enormously popular. It was just a
Hmm.
review of songs, one of them being Manhattan, as I mentioned, which has gone on to become a standard. But after that, that was really way more an inciting incident for the success of Rodgers and Hart than A Lonely Romeo had been.
Hmm.
And it was after that moment that they are writing shows, they're writing the songs that I mentioned, they're writing film scores, particularly in the 1930s they're really at the top of their game as collaborators. No one could really match their level of success, except maybe the Gershwin brothers, who I accidentally alluded to earlier. So, pardon my slip there. So, at that point, they're off to the races. They're doing great. Everything's going well on the surface. But there were problems within the collaboration, as there so often is. They were two very different people. Richard Rodgers, the composer, was very exacting. He liked to work a very specific way. He liked to get up early and do his work and go to bed like a normal person. And he had a family. I mean, all of these things made his life look very different from that of his collaborator, Lorenz Hart, who was prone to depression, prone to alcoholism. He was a closeted homosexual, which bedeviled him his entire career, impacted him in untold tragic ways, and made it very difficult for the two of them to work together. In fact, the way that they would work is Rodgers would write a tune, and then he would literally lock Lorenz Hart in a room and be like, please write these lyrics. Right?
Yeah, it always sounds to me, and I don't want to be an armchair psychologist here, but it always sounds to me like this man has severe ADHD, because the way that Rodgers talks about him in the original, in his letters and all of the stuff left behind, he's just like, I had to lock him in a room, because if I didn't, he could not do it. But if I locked him in a room and said, you can't get out, then he'd sit down and be like, all right, I have this much time before I have to be out of here, so I will write you a song. It just sounds like he's massive ADHD and procrastinates until you're nailed to the wall.
And then produces some of the most brilliant
amazing stuff.
Lyrics. The most brilliant lyrics anyone ever created.
Exactly.
I mean, just unbelievable. So imagine, that's why Richard Rodgers put up with him for 2 decades, right? Because their work was so good together that you're like, well, I can turn a blind eye. Sure, he's difficult, but look at the output, right? Well, by the early 1940s, Rodgers was past that. He was really over it. It had been too much.
Worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, it was getting worse and worse and worse. It was getting harder and harder and harder for Lorenz Hart to be who he was. And
the alcoholism that went along with that was getting worse and worse and worse. And so it was, he could lock him in a room and he wouldn't be able to produce,
Right.
So like that. Which sounds really, that's a horrible sentence that I just said. Like, he'd lock him in a room and he couldn't get anything done. But I was like, well, of course. But, that was part of their
the caged collaborators.
Yeah.
No,
he'd go away and he couldn't find him. Yeah. Like, he'd be looking all over
weeks
the
on
world
end,
for
he'd be
him.
on a bender. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'm totally paraphrasing here, and maybe you know it more exactly than I do. But there is a very famous quote where Richard Rodgers said something along the lines of, I enjoy a drink or two, and Lorenz Hart is sometimes sober.
Yeah.
Right. That's the way that it was with the two of them. And as you're right, the closer they got to 1940, the worse that got.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons. And so in 1940 is where we see Teresa Helburn, who again was the co-producer with Lawrence Langner of the Theater Guild. They had done unbelievable work. They had presented unbelievable things. And they had fallen on some hard times. Now, let me back up a little bit. In 1931, they had produced a play, the Theater Guild had produced a play called Green Grow the Lilacs. Now, this play was written by a 32-year-old Oklahoma native named Lynn Riggs, and it was a play with music. There were singing cowboys and prairie songs. It was not a musical. He did not attempt it to be a musical. It was, cowboys sitting around a campfire singing, as would be appropriate for them to do. And that was what he was trying to capture. In fact, he said in an interview when the play premiered in 1931, he said, the intent has been solely to recapture in a kind of nostalgic glow, but in dramatic dialogue more than in song, the great range of mood which characterized the old folk ballads and songs I used to hear in my Oklahoma childhood. Their quaintness, their sadness, their robustness, their simplicity, their heart or body humors, their sentimentalities, their melodrama, their touching sweetness. That might sound familiar if you're familiar with Oklahoma,
It
but
might.
at any rate, we're getting there. So Green Grow the Lilacs premieres in 1931. It didn't run for long. It ran for about 64 performances. But nevertheless, Brooks Atkinson's famed New York Times critic said it was not merely a refreshing contribution to the lore of American theater, but stimulating entertainment full of sunshine and the tingle of open air. So
Mm-hmm.
this show, which didn't run real long, nevertheless made an impact. And though it didn't run super long on Broadway, it did have a life in this growing regional theater movement, little
Mm-hmm.
theater movement. Um, so it was a play that was known to theater makers, right?
Yeah.
And so in 1940, Teresa Helburn goes to see a revival of this play produced by the Westport Country Playhouse in Connecticut. And at this point, the Theater Guild is down to $30,000 in the bank. Now, this organization had been massive, and I will go into that in greater detail on another episode.
Mm-hmm.
But this organization had been massive. They had their own theater on Broadway, the Guild Theater on Broadway. And they were down to $30,000 in the bank. Now, while I wish I had $30,000 in the bank at the moment, for a Broadway producer, that ain't that much, right? You're not making many shows with
Even in the
$30,000.
1940s.
Exactly,
That's nothing.
even in 1940. So when she saw, I love the fact that she saw this revival and she suddenly thought, wait a minute, what if we turn Green Grow the Lilacs into a musical? What if we, instead of it just being a play with music, as Lynn Riggs had written it, what if we musicalize it fully? And that was her thought. We're going to use this as the vehicle for
Mm-hmm.
bringing the Theater Guild back to what it had been,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, what does she do? Well, she called in a favor, right?
Mm-hmm.
She remembered her buddy Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart, her buddies Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart, whose careers had really taken off when they had worked with the
And
Theater
said,
Guild in
I need a
1925.
favor.
Yeah. And she said, hey, buddy, remember how you were about to quit the business? And then I gave you an office and a show to write for. And suddenly you're like the greatest thing ever. How about we do that again? Only the roles were reversed. Suddenly, instead of she being the one giving Rodgers and Hart a handout, they were the ones doing it for her. And so she asked, and Richard Rodgers was very, very interested in this idea. He thought it was fantastic. But he went to his buddy Lorenz Hart when he could find him.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I've been approached by Teresa Helburn about doing this musicalization of Green Grow the Lilacs. And the response that he got from Lorenz Hart was, you know what? I'm going to go to Mexico. I want to go on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
And Richard Rodgers knew enough to know that if Lorenz Hart went on vacation to Mexico, that might be the end. He may not come back, right?
Yeah.
It could be the end of things for him. He was in a very, very fragile state. And so he told him, he said, listen, I really want to do this. And if you're not going to do it, I'm going to find somebody else to do it with me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where we see the collaboration begin with Oscar Hammerstein. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about Oscar Hammerstein either, except to say he was the grandson of a great opera impresario.
Mm-hmm.
He had worked in the family business, starting really as a stage manager,
Mm-hmm.
and then had started writing his own music, writing his own shows, musicals in the 1920s. Of course, he was best known for Showboat in 1927, which he wrote book and lyrics to Jerome Kern's score for. He also
Mm-hmm.
directed that show, though he wasn't credited officially with that. I think he was credited as a stage manager, right?
Yeah, because most of the time we didn't really have directors
Right,
at that
right.
point. We really, Hammerstein is part of the group that kind of figures out what a director does.
Yeah.
So,
And it's not until we have more literary canon of musical theater that we need a director to unify the vision, right?
mm-hmm.
Until then, it's okay to just have a guy telling people where to go and stand on the stage.
Yeah.
So yes, so that was his most famous work in 1927, and he'd really spent the next, decade, the intervening decade, hoping to catch lightning in a bottle twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's difficult when you peak at a relatively early age
Very young.
and then you just are trying to recreate that. Now, it's complicated by the fact that Showboat premiered in 1927, and then, as we discussed in the timeline episode, what happens in 1929, the stock
Black
market
Tuesday.
crashes and
Yeah.
the whole economics of everything changes. And so
Yeah.
that obviously affects production on Broadway. But he'd been working mostly in Los Angeles in film. You want
Hmm.
to talk a little bit about what he was doing there?
And we talked a
In
little bit in the timeline episode as
yeah,
well, but I mean, Hammerstein is, if nothing else, he's a structuralist. He really is very good with structure, and he's very, very good with kind of taking someone's idea and making sure that the audience narratively can follow along. And so
yeah,
he ends up being a script doctor in Hollywood, because there wasn't a lot of jobs on Broadway, and the only thing that was really thriving was film during the Great Depression, and he does a lot of kind of taking of scripts and rewriting them so that they arc correctly. Like, I mean, if there's one thing that theater history gives us, it's that, I mean, we've had the climactic plot structure, since the 1800s. So he was able to sit down and really kind of provide some kind of narrative arcing to that. So that's what he's doing there.
yeah, yeah. Really ahead of his time in so
Mm-hmm.
many ways. Absolutely. So, this was not the first time. Green Grow the Lilacs was not the first time that Richard Rodgers had said to Oscar Hammerstein, "Hey, buddy, you want to work together?" Now they had met when Richard Rodgers was a teenager and Oscar Hammerstein was in at Columbia.
Yeah.
But they had, and of course they were aware of each other, because they both had big careers,
Mm-hmm.
but they had not been particularly close, and certainly not collaborators.
Mm-mm.
So in the early 1940s, there was a moment when there was supposed to be a musicalization of Edna Ferber's book, Saratoga Trunk, and Rodgers and Hart were going to write the music. So of course, Richard Rodgers took that opportunity to invite Oscar Hammerstein to write the book. He's like, "You wrote Edna Ferber's Showboat. Why not come in and write with us for Saratoga Trunk?" Almost as soon as that show was announced in the papers, in the papes, it disappears. It's not going to happen. I don't know exactly why, except that it falls apart. But that was 1941. Well, a few months later, Rodgers is premiering a show in Philadelphia. He's had it with Lorenz Hart. He desperately wants to do this project that Helburn wants him to do with Green Grow the Lilacs. And he goes to visit Oscar Hammerstein at his farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania.
Highland
And
Farm.
yes, exactly. And he goes to visit him there and he tells them all that's going on. And Oscar Hammerstein, as only Oscar Hammerstein, who was the dearest human involved in musical theater, in my opinion, as only he can do, he said, "Listen, if you break it off with Lorenz Hart, it will kill him.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think you should do as much as you can with him. And then if there ever comes a time when he will not at all cooperate, I'll be there."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's exactly what happened. Basically, Rodgers gives Hart an ultimatum and says, "Okay, if you're not going to play nice, if you're going to go to Mexico and get drunk and not be seen for months on end, then I'm going to work with somebody else." Hart says, "Who do you have in mind?" Rodgers says, "Hammerstein." And Hart says, "Well, you couldn't pick anybody better."
Yeah.
So basically, that's the end of that.
Just a small plug. Highland Farm. Oscar Hammerstein's family actually got a hold of it, and
Yes.
like they own it now, and they're turning it into a museum. And it's a place of respect about his life. So this is where he wrote all of these
Yeah.
musicals. If
Yeah.
you were ever in Bucks County, like go see them. They're gonna do great work. So
Okay.
keep going.
Yeah, no, but also, guess who else has strong Bucks County connections? That's our friend Stephen Sondheim.
Well, yes. Well, we're gonna
We'll
have to
get
do a
there, I
whole
know.
episode on the relationship between those two, because I spent like a year in the Library of Congress in like looking at the letters between Stevie and Ock. They called him
I love
Ock
it. Yes.
and Stevie. If
Yeah.
our boys were gonna, if our girls were gonna be boys, one of their name was gonna be Oscar, and we were gonna
Yes.
call him Ock because
I love
it was
it.
like Dear Ock.
I love it.
OCK. So yeah,
You know-
we'd have to do that that episode as well, because that
Yes.
relationship is very special.
Yes, Dorothy Fields called him Aki, and I just
Yeah.
love it. I love it so much. But at any rate, there's a lot of musical theater stuff in Bucks County. Tiny little, one more little point about that. James Michener, who wrote the book on which the musical South Pacific was based, Tales from the South Pacific, also from Bucks County. kind of a hotbed there in Pennsylvania.
It's all about who you
So,
know.
yeah, it is true. Truer words were never spoken. So once that relationship with Rodgers and Hart was officially severed, Richard Rodgers went to work with Oscar Hammerstein, and
Mm-hmm.
immediately this kind of collaboration was exactly the way that Richard Rodgers wanted to work.
Yeah.
They were both both worked. I want to use the word responsibly, but that's not the right word. But they both worked faithfully on their projects.
They were
What do you
very
think the word is?
similar and came from
Yes.
very similar backgrounds. And I mean, anybody who's married knows there
Yeah.
are, when you were raised similarly in whatever things, those things tend to work pretty well.
Yeah.
So yeah, they do. They enmesh very well. But we'll talk about more in that on the second part of this episode as well.
Yes. And so that was that was a gift to Richard Rodgers, who had been, laboring through all of these difficulties that he had with Lorenz Hart for so many years. And suddenly he's working with Oscar Hammerstein, who sees the world much more closely to the way that he sees it, or at least works in that way. Interestingly, when he was offered the job of working on Green Grow the Lilacs, Oscar Hammerstein immediately said, "Oh, I know the show." He had pitched the idea years before to Jerome Kern, his collaborator on Showboat, and Jerome Kern had said no, because there's a murder in Act Two. Musicals don't have murders. So, at any rate, they that did not happen, obviously. But Hammerstein did eventually work on the show with Richard Rodgers, and they got to work under a tree one morning. They started mapping out the show in 1942. Very quickly, the first song that they wrote was "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." Now, it was enormously frustrating to Oscar Hammerstein that he would labor over lyrics, right? It would take him 3 weeks to get the perfect lyric. And part of that's probably because he's trying to infuse it with story and all that he's trying to put in there. And then he would give the lyric to Richard Rodgers, who could write, in 37 seconds, he could put a melody to it, just so quick. But one of the very first songs that they wrote together was "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning."
And it's a different way of working for Richard Rodgers too. You
Yes.
got to remember that is Rodgers always wrote the music and then would give it to Lorenz Hart, because it wouldn't have happened the other way around, right?
Right. Right.
And Oscar was like, "No, I write the story first."
Yeah.
Story first, and then you write the music to it, and it ends up, and we'll talk more about that too, but
The play's the
really
thing,
cool.
right?
Yeah.
The play's the thing. And you can see that even in the way that they work. I want to read to you, "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning," like I said, was their first song collaboration, the opening number of Oklahoma. And it's really ripped directly from Lynn Riggs' stage directions for his play. In the play, it's written, "It is a radiant summer morning several years ago, the kind of morning which, enveloping the shapes of earth, men, cattle in the meadow, blades of the young corn, streams, makes them seem to exist now for the first time, their images giving off a visible golden emanation that is partly true and partly a trick of imagination, focusing to keep alive a loveliness that may pass away."
So remember when I said that I spent a year in the Library of
Yes, I do remember that.
So Ock used to work on these, like those legal pads, and so they're all still in the Library of Congress. So you can hold the kind of the scene mapping that he did under the tree with Richard Rodgers, but then you can also see all of his brainstorming for all the lyrics. Like he just would write something and write something, then you'd see him kind of try something else, and it's really, really amazing how he wrote. It's watching his brain work. But I'm hearing all of those that description, and I'm remembering looking at this piece of paper that just had all of these words about open and sunlight and all of this kind of stuff that he would that's just amazing. I was
Yes.
like, "Oh,
Isn't that crazy?"
This is very reminiscent of
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So while they're working, they're mapping out the show. They're, working on they don't know it at the time, but it's going to be revolutionary, this musical that they're about to produce. And they're doing all the work to that end. Teresa Helburn, of course, as producer, is working to raise the money to put the show on. Now, I want to tell you what this show was capitalized for. $100,000. Now, because $100,000 in 1941, when she was doing this fundraising, means absolutely nothing, or 1942 means absolutely nothing to my brain, I'm going to adjust it for inflation. That would be like producing a show today for $1.8 million.
Which can't be done.
It can't be done. I don't think it's been done since like 1981. Maybe even sooner. Like it can't be done.
Yeah.
But that we talked a little bit about the economics of Broadway, and we'll do it again in later episodes. But that tells you how things have changed so much. She was looking to raise $100,000, which doesn't seem like that much, except that you've got this completely untested team. It's not Rodgers and Hart who did Sound of Music. I'm sorry, Rodgers and Hammerstein who did Sound of Music. It's Rodgers and Hammerstein who've never worked together before. And by the way, Hammerstein, right? He's been doing movies. What do we know about Hammerstein anymore on Broadway? So it was a very difficult thing for her to try to do, to raise this money. But she was very, very committed to the project. So, of course, once they had started the fundraising, which took a couple of years, they then brought in Ruben Mamoulian. Can you say it for me? Ruben?
Mamoulian?
Yes, please. Thank you. I never say it right.
Neither do I.
I don't. Well, I was counting
for
on
some
you.
Reason. Mamoulian, and like I'm always like, and I always want to. I was like, no, not the weird accent, Tracey.
Yes, I know.
Like I can't do it.
I'm gonna let you do it because I for sure can't. At any rate, he'd worked with everybody involved. He'd worked with Rodgers and Hart. He'd worked with Hammerstein. He'd worked with the Theater Guild. But he too, like Oscar Hammerstein, had been out producing films, directing films. And he saw this musicalization of Green Grow the Lilacs as an opportunity for him to come back to Broadway. And he jumped at the chance. Now, another really key player that they brought into this team was their choreographer, Agnes DeMille, niece of the great film producer Cecil B. DeMille. Agnes DeMille was an outstanding choreographer in her own right. And I wonder, Tracey, if you can talk a little bit about her work, particularly in regards to the Copeland ballet that she had produced in 1942 that led her to be a perfect fit for this project.
Okay, which one are you talking about?
I'm sorry, because you taught me about this.
And I'm like, I probably did, and I'm like, oh gosh, which one are we talking about? And my brain just went, oh no.
No, I'm sorry. I should have warned you that this was coming. She wrote, or she choreographed the rodeo ballet, where she's got
ballet. Yeah.
The
Okay,
Aaron Copland music.
That one, or
I'm
like
so sorry to put you on the spot.
And I was like, what year was that?
Right.
Anyway, so Agnes DeMille is one of those revolutionary figures in musical theater dance. She's also a very big name in dance history, and I am not a dance historian. What I know about what she did is that she was trying to take kind of American stylized movement and move it into, like, make it work for ballet, which is not, I mean, if you know anything about ballet, they do not like that.
Right.
They don't love that at all. But remember, it's the early 1900s where the U.S. really is trying to kind of figure out its own cultural identity. And so they're in all of the different places. You mentioned Copeland, the American composer, who's fabulous, but is trying to come up with an American sound, like a sound that is specifically American. And you're seeing a lot of artists that are trying to kind of incorporate, I don't know what American movement would be, quote unquote, but trying to take the idea of the cowboy and this cowboy aesthetic, which was very strong in this era.
Absolutely.
And find kind of a dance storytelling aspect to it. So she's part of that. But she does, quite frankly, she gives herself more credit for Oklahoma than she probably deserves. I say that nicely. I mean, if you watch her, all of the interviews that are done with her are like so long after this and she, I mean, to hear her talk, she wrote the thing,
Right,
like the whole
right.
thing. But she always comes back to, like, what does this ballet have to do with the play? Like, what does it have to do with the play? What does it have to do with the play? And because she's thinking about that, it actually helps integrate dance into musical theater in a way that we've never really thought about it before.
Right.
And so we give her tons of credit because of that.
Right.
I think that I'm just going to call him Ock likes to make opportunities for people. And he's like, what a great opportunity to, he is a cultural like identity thinker. So
The
he's,
dearest.
he's trying to say, who are the best people to work here, and what's the best way to tell this story, and how can we do it in a very kind of a cultural building way. And they settle on Miss Neville.
Yeah, and so they brought her in. Rodgers, Hammerstein, and Helburn, and likely Mamoulian, if I'm saying that correctly, had seen a production of that rodeo of ballet to Aaron Copland's music in 1942, and they decided, you know what, I think this young lady can help us, and so they brought her on board the team, and then
because otherwise the only other choreographers, literally, they know how to do jazz hands. Like,
right.
I mean,
right.
well, not jazz hands. Jazz hands hasn't come about yet, but it's all like the the Rockettes with their legs up in the air.
Can girls.
That's all we have, right?
Yes.
We don't have anybody who's going to be able to be like, ooh, these are cowboys.
Who's telling story through dance.
Exactly.
Right. And that's exactly what they needed, because that's what they were aiming for, was telling story. The play is the thing. So as each member of the team gets to work, of course, they're shaping the story, they're working the songs, everybody, casting's all going on. But then they also have this trouble of the title, because Green Grow the Lilacs was owned by MGM, the film company. They had the rights to the story. So Green Grow the Lilacs was off the table in terms of the title for the show. So they considered titles like Swing Your Honey, Oklahoma Honey, Party Tonight, Going to the Party, Laurie and Me. And in fact, when they opened out of town in New Haven, it was called Away We Go. Right? But that was quickly changed, obviously, to Oklahoma, but it wasn't changed to Oklahoma until after its Boston tryout, which came after New Haven. The concern
was Oklahoma actually in the out of town tryout? Or was that added?
No, they wrote a new number.
Yeah,
there was a new
added.
number. Yes.
Yeah. It's one of the reasons why it's the funniest thing is that the longer I did this, if you go away from Oklahoma for a long time and come back and you know it as the most integrated, Oklahoma is the song that sticks out to me like, huh?
Yeah, right.
Like what?
Right.
Of all of it. And so it feels like it's that thing that we put in there at the end.
Yeah. And they here's the problem. There was a 1939 novel, John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, in which he talks about Okies. And they didn't want this show to be confused with that. They didn't want people to think it was a musicalization of that. Of course, the tone of the stories were very, very different. And so they were scared of using the word Oklahoma, although ultimately they did. But I think that interpolating, if I may use that word, that song was part of saying, we're different. It's a different kind of Oklahoma than what Steinbeck's talking about. Right. So the show opens in New Haven. It runs for 4 performances. It was a mess. It was an actual mess. It was a mess. And so they brought in, we talked about Oscar Hammerstein being a doctor, a script doctor. They brought in a script doctor of their own, believe it or not, George Abbott, who will come up time and time again throughout the course of this podcast, not just this episode, but lots of them. A very famous, well-known script doctor, producer, director, all the things, who worked on Broadway for, it feels like a million years, but it was not quite that long, but it was a long time. And so they brought him in New Haven to do some work on it. And reviews were tepid. They were not angrily mean, but they weren't super warm. For instance, we've got the Meridian Record that says, it makes excellent medicine for the tired mind. It's a nice mixture of good, leavening comedy, some plot. Imagine that. Plot.
I bet he was like, what?
I know. And that's why we have to completely change the show after New Haven and Boston, right? A bit of drama and added specialties. And I'm sure that was written about Agnes DeMille's Dream Ballet. Likely, which I think will come up probably more later.
Hmm.
So in the Chicago Tribune, Cecil Smith wrote, "It will not be an unqualified success unless a great deal of revision takes place,
Hmm.
despite its attractive decors and hummable score. Particularly in the first act, it lurches from the folk play mood into heavy melodrama, then successively into typical musical comedy format." So a couple of things are happening
Huh.
here. This is such a new form that not only do the creators not know how to pull it off perfectly in the
Uh-huh.
beginning, but critics don't know what to make of it,
Yeah.
right? It's just all new.
Well, because
Uh
it's like you move from, it's like, ooh, it was really that folk style. I'm kind of liking this into heavy melodrama where you have, the death of Judd Fry and everything,
right.
and what happens there, and how do we keep that from being melodramatic? Because it would be, if you're just telling that story straight, it does feel like it's straight out of melodrama, doesn't it?
1000%. 1000%.
It's very, very cool.
Especially when you add characters like Ado Annie, who's
Oh
just so
gosh.
clearly, like comic relief. That whole Ado Annie Will Parker thing is just, yeah, absolutely. So I think that not only did the creators know exactly how to pull it off, but the critics had no idea how to classify it because there weren't terms to talk about it yet. All they had was the old paradigm of
They
musical
knew they were looking
comedy.
at something different.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
that's why you get the no legs, no jokes, no chance.
Yeah. So then the show moves into Boston, and there's a measles outbreak that goes through the
I haven't
cast.
heard that.
Yeah, a measles outbreak. Everybody was sick. It was terrible. I mean, they're really everything that could have gone wrong did, right? And the question is, oh my gosh, do we stick with it? We don't know. Do we have people who can go on? What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And then of course we get the famous no jokes, no leg or no legs, no jokes, no chance, which you talked about. And I'm assuming will come up more um in the subsequent episode when we talk more about that. But I will say maybe I'll save that for the next episode.
Okay.
Talking about that a little bit more and historiography surrounding that. So at any rate, we make it through Boston. Everybody's miserable. Everybody's wondering. Even the cast. I mean, imagine you're a part of this cast and you're like, wait a minute. This is not what things typically look like with a musical. Like
This is not what we're used to. We're used
this is
to
we
high production value. We're used
yeah.
to.
We're trying to achieve psychological realism here, or to some extent. Why are we trying to get into the egos and ids of these characters? I mean, it was just a very, very different, and certainly not only did the critics pick up on that, but also the company members did. And some of them thought it was fantastic, and others were like, are we going to have a job next week?
Exactly.
Because they expected it to close at any moment. So opens, there's a measles outbreak in Boston. It opens as Away We Go. And then very quickly, there's a turnaround as those shows used to do. Very quickly after, they would play New Haven, Philadelphia, Baltimore, all those cities or whatever their circuit was. And then they would open very quickly. There was not a lot of time for changes and revisions, although many were made in the case of Oklahoma. Including the name change to Oklahoma. And so the show opened in New York at the St. James Theater on March 31st of 1943. The house was not full. In fact, they went out. You've got creators and producers of the show running around Times Square handing out tickets to service members who are in town. Remember the
They
World War
went
II
across the street to the bar that the theater wasn't the Theater Guild, but the war support group for musical theater had, and they were like, we're here's a ticket, come sit here, here's a ticket. So there's this large volume of uniformed service members in the audience.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will come up again as we talk about Oklahoma and how it was used to remind service people why we're fighting this war that we're fighting. But that would come at a later time. But yeah, so they're really, really trying to make this work. But it's far from a gimme. I mean, we think today, oh man, it's Oklahoma. It was a hit from the beginning, but it was not. They were handing out tickets in the streets, begging people to come and see it. And then, of course, the reviews hit And here's a few, just a sampling of those. In the New York Times, Lewis Nichols wrote, "For years, they've been saying the Theater Guild is dead, words that obviously will have to be eaten with breakfast this morning." How
Awesome.
about that? Way to go, Teresa Halburn. He called it a truly delightful musical play.
Mm-hmm. New
That's a phrase.
term.
Yeah, that's a
It's
phrase
a
we
new
haven't heard
term.
before. Yeah, a musical play. And in fact, I think the early printings of the libretto called it a musical play. Didn't it say a musical Oklahoma, a musical play?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. This is Nichols writing in the New York Times. Wonderful is the nearest adjective for this excursion of the Guild combines a fresh and infectious gaiety, a charm of manner, beautiful acting, singing, and dancing.
Mm-hmm.
How about that? Burns Mantle in the New York Daily News wrote, "It was the most thoroughly and attractively American musical comedy since Showboat." I think that is probably a great place to end talking about reviews because that's a great segue into what you're going to be talking about in episode 2
Mm-hmm.
as we dig more into the cultural impact and other things surrounding the premiere of Oklahoma. But I want to circle back real quickly to Lorenz Hart.
Mm-hmm.
Lorenz Hart, there were many people, many empty seats, like I said, but Lorenz Hart was one of the people in attendance. He sat in row B. And afterwards, he ran into his dear collaborator, Richard Rodgers, at Sardi's, and he said, "I've never had a better evening in my life. This show will be around for 20 years."
Mm-hmm. And
So
he was
I
wrong. It's going to be around for
Here
the
we, what
rest of
are we?
time.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Way more than that. In fact, it ran 2,212 performances on Broadway, more
Which
than
is
5 years.
unheard of.
Tracy, it was 3 times longer than anything else had previously run on
Yeah.
Broadway. The tour ran for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
10 years. There was a special USO company of the show
Yep.
just to go around to entertain the troops. Um, so this show, and like I said, we'll get more into this as Tracy unpacks cultural impact and we talk about other things surrounding the show in the next episode. But it was earth-shattering.
Mm-hmm.
Everything changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly people began to sit up and take notice of musical plays as this one was referred to in a way that they never had before. And the fledgling team of Rodgers and Hammerstein, of course, go on to completely reinvent the wheel
Mm-hmm.
and everything for the next 15 years, depending on when you say the golden age ends, which is up to debate. Everything for the next 15 years is attempting to try to emulate what they did.
Yeah.
So, or reacting against the norm that they established with Oklahoma.
Yeah.
So it's a great place to start as we discuss the musical, what it is, where it's been, where it's going, all of those things. One other thing that I do want to say, however, is I'm a big inflation calculator person.
I love it.
So I looked at tickets. Tickets for Oklahoma ranged from $1.10 to $4.40, which is the modern equivalent of $20 to $80.
Mm-hmm.
What show are you going to see on Broadway for $20 these days?
None. I spent an entire month's rent to see Hamilton on Broadway in May or March of 2016. So almost a year after it opened.
Uh-huh. Totally worth it too, by the way, right?
I sat in the back row
Mm-hmm.
on an entire month's rent.
Yeah.
Like, and and both of us were like, I don't know what I've done. What kind of bad decision have I made in my life?
But it feels so right.
But yeah, I mean, $20 to $80, and they kept it that way.
Mm-hmm.
As part of their kind of economic strategy to get people coming, and they Rodgers and Hammerstein have a very good banker behind them. We'll put it this way, and we'll talk about this more next time. But what they do is they build an audience for American musical theater.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that they do it.
Excellent. And then just one other point that I want to make about this team of Rodgers and Hart, we see something that I want to applaud them for was their willingness to work with women. And we see that in a couple of ways. Number one, we see it in them taking an idea from Teresa Helburn right? The producer of the Theater Guild, who asked them to do this project to begin with, and they were right on board with that. Then we see them bringing on Agnes DeMille, which I love that they were, open to working with women. And then we know again when they took on the producer role because they made so much money as creators that they started producing. They work again with Dorothy Fields. It was her idea to do Annie Get Your Gun, and she went to them with the idea, and they were like immediately, yes, let's do it, let's go. And I love
be the producers. We don't want to write it. We're writing something else.
But I love their willingness, which was not necessarily, everybody didn't share that willingness. I love their willingness to work with female collaborators in a time when that wasn't necessarily the norm in other venues. Yeah. So I do want to point that out about them because
if you read anything about them, like go read some biographies. They have very strong wives.
Yes. And daughters.
And daughters, and daughters who are part of this discussion. So,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So we did it.
I can't believe it.
I can't either. Backstory.
We still have to split this episode into two, but we did it.
We did it. We have recorded this episode once before, and I think we were at like 90 minutes, and I hadn't even gotten to like New Haven. So we decided to revisit this.
We did it.
Do the fast and dirty Oklahoma, and it'll still be 2 parts, but it'll be 2 much more manageable parts. So thank you, Tracey, for keeping me on point.
Thank you.
And keeping me from saying more than I need to say, which is always a problem. And thank you for listening to the Dr. Broadway podcast. And remember, like we said, next episode is Tracey. She's going to be diving into some more of the impact surrounding Oklahoma, some more of the changes that it brought about in musical theater. And in addition to that, she's going to be talking about some of the new norms that it established, like the development of a cast album. So those are all coming up in our next episode. So be sure you tune in for that. In the meantime, thanks for listening to this one. So that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Thanks so much for joining us, and tune in next time when Tracey will be talking more about Oklahoma. In the meantime, if you have any questions for us, any shows you'd like for us to talk about, anything you need for us to know, by all means, reach out to us at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram and TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast. Thanks for listening.